There is a loneliness that doesn't look like sadness. It doesn't always come with tears. It doesn't always come with despair. It doesn't even come with a clear reason. You can still function. You can still answer messages. You can still do what you're supposed to do. You can still laugh in the right moments, respond in the right tone, hold the right expressions on your face. But inside, something is thin. Not broken, not dramatic, thin. As if your life is happening behind a transparent wall. You're present, but not fully inside the moment. You're surrounded by people, but the contact doesn't land. You speak, and your words feel like they don't reach the room. You listen, and what you hear feels distant, almost irrelevant, as if you're overhearing a conversation from another floor of the building. And this is where many people make a mistake. They call it depression, because depression is the closest word available for anything that feels empty. But emptiness is not one thing. The mind uses the same word for different psychological states, and that creates confusion. It makes people pathologize something that is not necessarily illness. This channel doesn't diagnose, it reveals. And what it reveals here is uncomfortable. Sometimes the loneliness you feel after awakening is not depression. It is separation. It is the psyche reorganizing after the collapse of the persona. Carl Jung observed that the most common form of human adaptation is the persona, the social self, the mask, the acceptable identity that allows you to function within the expectations of your environment. The persona is not fake in the simple sense. It is not a lie you consciously tell. It is a psychological solution, a negotiated identity built to protect belonging, a way of being that reduces conflict, increases approval, and makes the world respond to you in predictable ways. The persona is the part of you that knows how to be understood. And to be understood is not a small thing. Being understood is safety. It means you can predict how people will treat you. It means you know what role you're playing and what the rules of the game are. It means you can stay included without constantly improvising. But there is a hidden cost to this solution. The cost is that the persona is built for society, not for wholeness. It selects certain traits and suppresses others. It emphasizes what is rewarded and hides what is inconvenient. Over time, you don't just perform the persona, you become identified with it. You start believing that the mask is the self. And then something happens. Something changes in the psyche. Sometimes it's a loss. Sometimes it's an awakening. Sometimes it's the slow collapse of borrowed meaning, values you inherited, goals you pursued because they were approved, relationships you maintained because they kept your identity stable. Sometimes it happens quietly. You realize you can't pretend anymore. You can't keep living for the script. And when that realization arrives, the persona begins to weaken. Not because you decide to destroy it, because it no longer works. The mask becomes heavy, the performance becomes obvious to you. The words you used to say automatically start feeling staged. You notice how often you're not speaking, but negotiating. How often you're not living, but managing perception. And once you notice that, the old social life starts to feel thin. Because social life is often built on shared masks. When you stop wearing yours with conviction, you start noticing everyone else's. You notice the politeness that is actually fear. You notice the confidence that is actually defense. You notice the jokes that are actually control. You notice the warmth that is actually bargaining. You don't become cynical on purpose. You become unable to unsee. And this is where the loneliness appears. Not because you hate people, but because the old form of connection no longer satisfies you. Connection through masks begins to feel like a transaction, like everyone is exchanging acceptable versions of themselves, like intimacy is being simulated rather than lived. So you sit in a room full of people and feel alone, and you start asking yourself what's wrong. You might even start worrying that you're broken. Because you remember how you used to feel. You remember how you used to be able to join in. You remember how you used to care more about what people were saying. How you used to be able to fill silence easily. How you used to laugh and actually feel inside the laughter. Now you feel separate, and separation looks like depression to someone who doesn't have another map. Jung gives another map.
Sometimes this loneliness is not a symptom to eliminate, it is a consequence of differentiation. Differentiation is the process of becoming less merged with the collective, less governed by shared expectations, less dependent on belonging for identity. That sounds liberating, but psychologically, differentiation feels like exile at first. Because the human mind is wired for the group, it depends on shared meaning and shared roles. The persona is built from that dependence. It is a bridge into the collective. So when the persona collapses, your bridge weakens. And the first experience of losing a bridge is not freedom, it's distance. You still stand on the same ground, but you can't cross into the same kind of connection. The old conversational rituals feel empty. The old social performances feel exhausting. The old emotional agreements feel artificial. So you withdraw, sometimes physically, sometimes internally. And withdrawal feels quiet, not peaceful, quiet. The quiet is disturbing because it reveals something most people avoid: how much of their social life is sustained by unconscious participation. The jokes you laugh at to belong, the complaints you echo to stay included, the opinions you perform to signal identity, the agreement you offer to avoid friction. When you stop doing those things automatically, social life becomes less fluid. It becomes more conscious, and conscious social life is harder. It requires choice. Most people don't want to choose in social space. They want to flow. They want to be carried by shared rituals. So when you stop flowing, you feel separate. This is one form of loneliness, the loneliness of no longer being carried. But there is another layer. When the persona collapses, you don't only lose social ease, you lose a certain kind of internal reassurance. The persona gives you a stable image of yourself. It tells you who you're supposed to be. It keeps contradictions out of awareness. It creates coherence by excluding complexity. So when the persona weakens, complexity returns. Parts of you edited out begin to show up. The part that doesn't want to be nice, the part that wants to be left alone, the part that doesn't care about being understood, the part that is tired of explaining, the part that suspects love has been conditional. These parts do not feel socially safe, so when they rise, you feel less interested in performing connection, because connection often requires self-editing again, and you are no longer willing. So you become quieter. But quietness is misunderstood by you and by others. Others might call you cold or distant or different. They might interpret your quietness as judgment. They might accuse you of arrogance. Sometimes that accusation is accurate. Sometimes ego inflation follows awareness, and you become detached in a way that hides superiority. But sometimes it's not superiority. Sometimes it's simply the inability to pretend, the inability to keep presenting a socially acceptable self when you feel the raw self behind it. Jung would say, when you stop identifying with the persona, you begin to encounter the self, meaning the total psyche, the deeper structure that includes both conscious and unconscious. But encountering the self is not a warm spiritual experience by default. Often, it feels like alienation, because your conscious identity was built through adaptation, and now the deeper psyche is asking for truth. Truth is not always socially compatible, so you feel torn. You can go back into the group and perform again, or you can remain in your new awareness and feel separate. That tension produces loneliness, and this is where people start making dangerous compromises. They return to the persona to relieve the loneliness. They become socially fluent again. They become agreeable again. They become easy again. Not because they believe in it, because they miss connection. But the connection they get is thin, because it requires self-editing, so they feel lonely even while surrounded. That is the cycle. Then they begin to fear the loneliness itself. They begin to treat it like an illness. They search for stimulation. They keep themselves busy. They fill time with noise. They chase interactions that don't feed them just to avoid being alone with the quiet.
Because quiet feels like nothing, and nothing feels like death to a psyche trained by constant social engagement. But Jung would say, quiet is not death. Quiet is space. Space for unconscious material to surface. Space for reflection. Space for the psyche to reorganize itself without the constant demands of the persona. The problem is that modern life hates space. It fills space immediately with entertainment, productivity, social obligations, identity performance. So when space appears, it feels wrong. That wrongness is often labeled depression. But depression has a particular quality. Depression is heavy. It drains vitality. It collapses desire. It reduces capacity to imagine the future. The loneliness after awakening can look different. It can feel lucid. It can feel like you are not sad, but you are unsatisfied. You can still feel desire, but the old objects of desire no longer appeal. You can still function, but the functioning feels mechanical. You can still connect, but the connection feels scripted. So you feel alone in a new way, alone in your perception. It's not that no one is there, it's that no one seems to be living on the same level of truth. And again, this can be inflation. You can become convinced that you are the only one who sees. But it can also be a genuine shift in consciousness. You begin to see that much of social life is built on the avoidance of interiority. People speak to avoid silence. They joke to avoid discomfort. They moralize to avoid vulnerability. They argue to avoid intimacy. And when you stop participating unconsciously, you feel like you're watching a performance. You can still care for people, but you feel separate from the performance. That separation is lonely, because most people bond through shared performance. They bond through shared opinions, shared identities, shared moral outrage, shared humor, shared narratives. But when your old narratives collapsed, you lost your easy points of entry. You don't want to pretend outrage you don't feel. You don't want to echo beliefs you no longer trust. You don't want to perform certainty you no longer have. So you have fewer hooks into the collective, and you feel alone. Jung would say, this is the price of individuation. Not individuation as self-expression, individuation as differentiation from the collective psyche. The collective psyche is the shared mental environment, the assumptions, roles, and values that most people take for granted. When you live inside it, you feel belonging. When you step out of it, you feel exile. Not because the collective hates you, because you no longer speak the same language naturally, and language is how people bond. So you might notice that conversations feel strangely empty now. People discuss status, but you can't care the same way. People discuss plans, but the plans feel like avoidance. People discuss success, but success looks like captivity. So you listen, and you feel like you're on the outside. And then the mind does something dangerous. It begins to judge. Judgment is a way to protect yourself from longing. Because if you judge the collective, you don't have to admit you miss it. You don't have to admit you miss the ease of belonging. So you call everyone shallow. You call everyone asleep.
You call everyone performative. That feels powerful, but it's also lonely, because contempt separates you further. Jung would say, if your loneliness is filled with contempt, it may not be pure differentiation. It may be a defense. But even without contempt, loneliness can persist. Because the deeper issue is not other people, it's that the old mode of connection no longer works. The old mode was identity-based. You connected through roles: the good one, the responsible one, the funny one, the helper, the achiever, the stable one. Those roles created predictable relationships. People knew what to expect from you. You knew how to be loved. But when the persona collapses, those roles become less convincing.
And without roles, connection becomes more real. But more real is harder. It requires you to show up without a script. It requires you to be seen without performing. And that is terrifying, because you might not be liked. The persona was likable. The raw self is not always likable. So you hesitate, you keep distance, you keep things polite, and the loneliness remains. This is why the loneliness after awakening often comes with a strange sensation. You can feel people, but you can't touch them, like there is something missing in the exchange. What's missing is the old contract. The old contract was, I will be acceptable and you will include me. When you stop being acceptable in the old way, you don't receive the same inclusion, and that feels like loneliness. But the loneliness is not necessarily the loss of people, it's the loss of an agreement. Jung would say, when you step out of the collective, you lose automatic belonging. You must find a different form of connection. Not connection through persona, connection through truth. But truth-based connection is rare. It requires two people willing to tolerate discomfort, two people willing to speak without performance, two people willing to sit in silence without filling it with identity. So in the transition, you may have fewer connections, and that reduction feels like loneliness. Again, this isn't necessarily depression, it's the narrowing of what you can tolerate. Your psyche can't tolerate fake warmth anymore. It can't tolerate relationships built on you being useful. It can't tolerate conversations built on avoidance. So you have fewer options. Fewer options doesn't mean you are broken. It means your standards of reality increased. But increased standards bring loneliness because reality is rarer than performance. This is why the loneliness after awakening can feel intelligent. It doesn't feel like despair. It feels like distance. And distance can be painful because it removes distraction. It forces you to see what your life actually is. It forces you to face what you used to cover with busyness. It forces you to notice the emptiness inside certain relationships. It forces you to confront how much of your identity was relational. Who are you when no one is asking you to be anything? That question is exposed by loneliness. The persona hates that question because it has no answer. The persona only knows how to respond to expectations. So when expectations become irrelevant, the persona collapses. And in that collapse, loneliness appears, not as punishment, as reality. Reality is, you are alone in your psyche. No one fully shares your inner world. The collective gives the illusion of shared inner life through shared scripts. When scripts dissolve, you feel the truth. Each person is enclosed. That enclosure is existential loneliness. It doesn't mean you can't love. It means love becomes no longer based on roles. Love becomes more serious, more demanding, because it requires presence, not performance. And presence is difficult when you're still reorganizing. So you wait, you live in the quiet, and the quiet hurts, not because it is meaningless, because it is honest, and honesty strips.
So if you're feeling this loneliness, if you're not sad but you are separated, if you're not hopeless but you are detached, don't rush to label it. Don't rush to anesthetize it, because sometimes this loneliness is the psyche creating distance from the collective so that you can hear your own inner life again. Not to become superior, not to become isolated forever, to become real. The danger is confusing this stage with illness and trying to cure it by returning to performance. That will relieve the loneliness briefly, but it will bring back the exhaustion, and you already know that exhaustion. The other danger is romanticizing loneliness and turning it into identity, turning distance into superiority. That will deepen isolation. So the question is not how to escape loneliness quickly. The question is what loneliness is revealing. Because loneliness after awakening often reveals something you avoided. You were connecting through your persona, and your persona is no longer convincing, so you can't connect the same way. That is painful, but it might also be the first time you can build connection that doesn't require self-betrayal. This channel doesn't promise that connection will appear on schedule. It doesn't sell hope, it reveals dynamics. And the dynamic here is simple, brutal, and strangely relieving. Not every quiet is depression. Sometimes it's the sound of a false identity dissolving. So here's the question that remains when the video ends. If you stripped away the roles that made you understandable, if you stopped performing the self that kept you included, would you still call what you feel depression? Or is it the first honest loneliness of becoming a person who can't live through masks anymore? Silence.